The U.S. and Ukraine have signed a 10-year bilateral security agreement on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said the pact would protect not just his country, but the world from Russian aggression. The G7 leaders also backed a multi-billion-dollar deal to use frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine strengthen its defenses and pay for reconstruction. We have our chief political correspondent, Nina Haase, in Bari, Italy, reporting for us. Nina, give us the latest from the G7 summit on what you're hearing about this $50 billion loan.
Well, Claire, this is being hailed as a big success all around. We heard that in the report. And it is something where the G7 think that they found a very good solution for the question that they've been asking themselves for a very long time now. How can we give more flexibility in terms of financial flexibility to Ukraine and fast? How can we support them considerably? And so now the idea is to have $50 billion worth of a loan that the G7 countries would take out from the banks and then give that money to Ukraine. So once all those details are being spelled out by the country's finance ministers, Ukraine will have access to that money, and then the loan would be paid back by the proceeds from those frozen Russian assets. And here, this is also a political message that the G7 want to send to Vladimir Putin to say, we have a Trump-proof mechanism here at play. That is something, it doesn't matter whether any of us get thrown out of office, whether Joe Biden has to make space for Donald Trump, for example, in the US, or whether any of the G7 countries find themselves struggling financially, Ukraine still has a lot of money that it can use.
So let's put a finer point on this and get into the financial details just for a moment. This money, it's a loan, as we've said. Who exactly would Ukraine pay it back to? And who is going to take a hit if a Ukraine crippled by war can't make payments?
That is something that the finance ministers now have to spell out in detail, just which bank they would go to. But it would be the individual countries that would take out that loan, and Ukraine has to pay it back over time. All those details, just what the deadlines are, etc., that is not something that we know the details of at the moment. The other important question to ask in this context is also, of course, what happens if the G7, if around the world countries do decide to lift those sanctions on Russian assets. Now, that would, of course, mean that Russia would have access to those assets again. And then, of course, the countries that have given Ukraine the loan would have to pay that back out of their national budgets.
Nina Haase reporting for us from Bari, Italy. Thank you so much. And we can hear more about this, the latest at the G7, and also this $50 billion loan to Ukraine from Claudia Schmucker. She is the head of the Center for Geopolitics, Geoeconomics and Technology at the German Council on Foreign Relations. A very warm welcome to the show. We heard U.S. President Joe Biden, he's called this historic. Do you agree?
Absolutely. It was very important for the G7 summit to provide unity with regard to Ukraine, because this is what everyone is looking at. And there had been a lot of discussions and conflicts about how to provide this kind of loan. And to have an agreement, even before the summit started, a political agreement, it was just said we need to figure out the details and the legal details. But to have this unity, to have a loan by all G7 summit, this is really historic and an important signal to Russia and to the Ukraine.
Now, let's get a little bit into the details, if I may. Some who are watching this are probably asking, why is this just the interest? Why wasn't it possible to just hand over frozen Russian assets to Ukraine? Would that have also been an option available?
Well, this topic was pushed a lot by the United States, but there had been disagreement between European countries and the United States. The majority of the issue of the asset is in Europe. The problem is that these are legal concerns. We cannot just seize Russian assets. This would be illegal. And this is why European countries were so hesitant to do that. And this is why we have this kind of compromise that was taken to use the interests on the profits of frozen central bank assets. And this is something where the European countries can go with.
So seizing the assets would have been illegal. Looking at this decision to just make the interest available, I'm wondering whether you think this step alone could perhaps deepen distrust that you see particularly among some countries in the global south, that the West is weaponizing the financial system.
This is a question that needs to be considered very carefully, and this is also why it was decided not to use the assets, because the banking system was seen as something that is neutral, cannot be weaponized, and this is why we have this kind of compromise that we only use the interest on the profits as collateral, but the danger is there.
And you think that will put minds at ease that it's just the interest that's being used?
I think it's a very good compromise. I'm not sure it will ease all the minds, but I think it's the best that we can have, and it's important that we have this kind of agreement for the Ukraine.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about rebuilding. We know Ukraine's recovery costs have risen to 486 billion euros, according to the World Bank, and we are now only talking about deals addressing a fraction of that. Where is money going to come from to help rebuild Ukraine?
You mean coming from this loan? And then we have also individual countries supporting the Ukraine. We had in Berlin the Ukraine Recovery Conference. So countries are really trying to figure out how to support the Ukraine. But it's important that G7 as a group also gives this kind of loan.
Okay. I want to turn now to the G7 generally. We're seeing an increasingly unstable, fragile, insecure world. Do you think formats like the G7, with these world leaders meeting together in Italy, are the best way to deal with these pressing global problems?
The G7, a long time ago, the G7 is an important forum. We live in a geoeconomic world. We see more and more fragmentation. And the G7 is a group of like-minded countries that share common goals and values. So these are democratic countries. These are countries that have market economies, and they share these goals and they want to support the Ukraine. So it's important that the G7 come together. But as you mentioned, we do have global problems that G7 itself cannot solve anymore. And therefore, we need a lot of outreach. Italy invited a lot of countries to join the summit. We also need other forums. We still have the G20, we have international organizations. So G7 cannot solve everything, but if this group is united and can send a strong signal to conflict or to global problems, this is already important.
Well, thank you so much for joining us with your insights today. That is Claudia Schmucker with the German Council on Foreign Relations.
Thank you so much.